The November wind cut through the century-old oaks of Arlington National Cemetery like an invisible blade, carrying the scent of dead leaves and sacred earth. Hundreds of military uniforms formed perfect rows along the main avenue, each soldier a statue of respect and discipline. Flags fluttered at half-mast against the gray sky, and in the distance the rhythmic sound of military drums echoed among the white marble tombstones that stretched as far as the eye could see. The funeral of General Thomas Jefferson Reynolds, 4 stars, decorated hero, brilliant strategist, had drawn the military elite from across the nation. Senators stood alongside admirals. Medal of Honor recipients bowed their heads in silence. Security was airtight, every name vetted, every face verified, every credential scrutinized with military precision. Amara Thompson arrived at Gate 7 in a simple black dress that had cost $38 at Target, her natural hair pulled back in a modest bun, her eyes swollen from 3 days of crying. She wore no jewelry except the titanium wedding band on her left hand and a small American flag pin on her collar. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she approached the security checkpoint, her hands clutching a black leather purse containing 25 years of memories. Sergeant Major Richard Thornton stood at the checkpoint like a granite monument, his chest decorated with ribbons. His blue eyes swept over Amara with practiced assessment, and in that instant, that crucial, damning instant, he made his judgment. "Ma'am, this is a restricted event," Thornton said, his hand rising in a stop gesture before Amara had even reached the gate. "Family and approved personnel only." "I know," Amara said quietly, her voice hoarse from grief. Name?" Thornton interrupted, his tone suggesting he was already certain her name wouldn't be found. "Amara Thompson, I'm General Reynolds' wife. Thompson?" Corporal Bradley Morrison cut in from Thornton's left, his young face twisted with skepticism. He exchanged a glance with his superior that said everything. "The general's wife is listed as Amara Reynolds. You just said Thompson." "Thompson is my maiden name," Amara explained, exhaustion making her words slow. "I kept it for my military service. But I'm legally Amara Reynolds. I have my marriage certificate." "Military service?" Lieutenant Patricia Sterling appeared from the security tent, her crisp uniform without a single wrinkle. "Ma'am, I've coordinated 15 military funerals, and family members don't typically claim military service at security checkpoints. It's, unusual." The word hung in the air like an accusation. "I'm a colonel," Amara said, her spine straightening despite her grief. "Retired, United States Air Force. I served—" "Ma'am," Thornton interrupted, his voice carrying the edge of someone losing patience. "I'm going to need to see identification, and I'm going to need you to step aside while we verify your claims. We have 300 verified guests waiting to enter, and we can't hold up the entire funeral for—" "For what?" Amara's voice cracked. "I'm his wife. I've been his wife for 25 years. I have identification. I have—" "Step aside, ma'am," Morrison commanded, moving forward to physically guide her away. His hand grabbed her arm, fingers digging into her bicep with unnecessary force. "You're disrupting a solemn military ceremony, and if you don't comply, we'll have to remove you from the premises." Behind them, a line of mourners had formed, generals, politicians, military families, all watching with varying degrees of discomfort and curiosity. Some pulled out cell phones, others whispered. A few parents pulled their children closer. "Look at my ID," Amara pleaded, trying to pull her military identification from her purse while Morrison maintained his grip. "Look at my marriage certificate." "Look at -- quote. "Those can be faked," Sterling said dismissively, though she hadn't even glanced at the documents. "Do you know how many people try to crash high-profile funerals? You show up here in—" Her eyes swept over Amara's simple dress with unconcealed disdain. "In that, claiming to be the wife of a 4-star general, using a different last name, and you expect us to just wave you through? If you believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, especially in their darkest moments, hit that subscribe button right now. This story will show you why it matters more than ever. My husband is being buried today. Amara's voice broke completely, tears streaming down her face as Morrison's grip tightened. I have been married to Thomas Reynolds for 25 years. I was with him when he died. I held his hand. Ma'am, you need to calm down, Thornton ordered, his hand moving to his radio. You're becoming hysterical, and I will not hesitate to have you forcibly removed if you cannot control yourself. I am calm, Amara shouted. I'm trying to attend my husband's funeral, and you won't let me through because... She stopped herself from saying it. Because I'm black, and you can't imagine a black woman married to a white 4-star general. Because you looked at my skin and my simple dress and decided I don't belong here. But she didn't have to say it. They all knew. Ma'am, I've asked you 3 times to step aside, Thornton said with finality. Morrison, escort her off the premises. If she resists, call Capitol Police. No! Amara tried to pull away, but Morrison's grip was iron. You can't do this. Call someone who knew him. Call General Williams. Call Isaiah Washington. They'll tell you who I am. Please. Everyone claims to know someone important, Sterling muttered, making notes on her clipboard. Security, we need backup at Gate 7. We have a disruptive individual claiming to be... People like you always have an excuse, Morrison hissed in Amara's ear as he started pulling her away, his fingers digging so hard into her arm that bruises were forming. Always have some story, always demanding special treatment. Well, not today. This is Arlington National Cemetery, and we don't play games here. Amara's heels scraped against the pavement as she tried to resist, her purse falling open and spilling its contents. Photos of her and Thomas in uniform, their wedding picture, letters with his handwriting. Morrison kicked them aside without looking, treating 25 years of her life like trash. You're hurting me, Amara cried out as Morrison twisted her arm behind her back, using a compliance hold typically reserved for violent criminals. I have a shoulder injury from service. Should have thought of that before you tried to crash a general's funeral, Morrison growled. Now you're going to leave quietly or you're going to leave in handcuffs. Your choice. The crowd of mourners had grown larger, phones held high, recording every moment. Some faces showed sympathy. Others showed contempt. A few showed satisfaction at watching someone get what they deserve. Colonel Dennis Blackwood emerged from the main staging area, his face red with fury, not at the treatment of Amara, but at the disruption. What the hell is going on here? He demanded. The ceremony starts in 10 minutes, and I have a line of VIPs backed up because of... His eyes landed on Amara, struggling in Morrison's grip, her dress torn at the shoulder, tears streaming down her face. Because of this? Sir, this woman is attempting to gain unauthorized access, Thornton reported crisply. Claims to be the general's wife, but can't provide adequate verification. She's been disruptive and physically resistant. I've ordered her removal. I am his wife, Amara screamed, her voice carrying across the cemetery, disturbing the solemn atmosphere. My husband is Thomas Reynolds. I've been married to him for 25 years. I'm a retired colonel. I served this country for 23 years. You cannot do this to me. Ma'am, if you were actually a colonel, you'd understand chain of command, Blackwood said coldly, his eyes scanning her simple dress, her lack of military bearing in this moment of extreme distress. You'd understand protocol. You'd understand that showing up to a 4-star general's funeral, dressed like you're going to a discount store and causing a scene is not how military personnel behave. Now, you can leave voluntarily, or Corporal Morrison here will escort you to a holding facility until Capitol Police can process your attempted disruption of a military funeral, which carries serious federal charges. Process the charges, came a voice from behind them. Major Jasmine Harris, pushing through the crowd, her dark skin flushed with anger, her own uniform decorated with combat ribbons. But you might want to know who you're actually talking to before you make this situation exponentially worse than it already is. Major Harris, stand down, Blackwood ordered. This is not your concern. This is absolutely my concern when I watch 3 military personnel physically assault Colonel Amara Reynolds, a decorated combat pilot with 2 distinguished flying crosses, at her own husband's funeral, Harris said, her voice carrying authority earned in combat zones. You want to talk about protocol, Colonel? How about the protocol that says the widow of the deceased should be treated with honor and respect? How about the protocol that says you verify identity before you put your hands on someone? Morrison's grip on Amara loosened slightly, uncertainty creeping into his eyes. Thornton's confident posture wavered. Sterling's clipboard lowered. Her name isn't on the primary list, Sterling said, but her voice had lost its certainty. We have protocols. We have ... quote. Her name is on the family list, Harris snapped, pulling out her phone and displaying a document. Amara Thompson Reynolds, wife of General Thomas Jefferson Reynolds, married July 15, 2000. Home address. That could be faked, Thornton interrupted, but he was grasping at straws now. Then call General Williams, Amara said through her tears. Call Isaiah Washington. Call anyone who knew my husband. They'll tell you. They'll... Wait, Blackwood said, his face going pale as something clicked in his memory. His eyes moved from Amara's face to the scattered photos on the ground. Photos showing Amara in Air Force dress blues standing next to General Reynolds. Wait just a goddamn minute. The ceremony was supposed to start in 8 minutes. And in the distance, walking toward Gate 7 with purposeful stride, came General Isaiah Washington, 4 stars gleaming on his shoulders, his dark face set in an expression of barely controlled fury. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. Thornton, Morrison, Sterling, and Blackwood snapped to attention instinctively. Even civilian mourners sensed something significant was about to happen. Washington's eyes swept the scene. Amara with her dress torn, her arm bruised, her face wet with tears. Morrison still holding her, her personal items scattered on the ground like garbage. The crowd with phones raised. Release her, Washington commanded, and Morrison's hands flew away from Amara as if she'd caught fire. Now. Sir, we were just... Thornton began. I didn't ask for an explanation, Sergeant Major. I gave you an order. Corporal Morrison, Colonel Blackwood, Lieutenant Sterling, you will stand at attention and you will not move until I tell you otherwise. They obeyed instantly, terror replacing arrogance. Washington moved to Amara, his own eyes glistening with emotion, grief for his lost friend and fury at how that friend's wife had been treated. He bent down, gently helping her stand, careful of her injured shoulder. He picked up her scattered belongings with reverence, treating each photo and letter like the sacred object it was. Colonel Reynolds, Washington said softly, using her military rank and married name, I am so deeply sorry for your loss and for this disgrace. They wouldn't let me through, Amara whispered, to my own husband's funeral. They wouldn't even look at my ID. They said I was lying. They said, I know, Washington said, rage and sorrow mixing in his voice. I know exactly what they said, and what they didn't say but were thinking. He turned to face the 4 military personnel, and his voice carried across the entire cemetery. This is Colonel Amara Thompson Reynolds. She is a retired United States Air Force colonel with 23 years of distinguished service. She flew F-16s in Operation Iraqi Freedom. She has 2 distinguished flying crosses, a Bronze Star with Valor, and a Purple Heart from when her aircraft was hit by enemy fire over Fallujah and she still managed to complete her mission and bring her plane home. She's logged over 3,000 flight hours. She's trained hundreds of pilots. She's saved countless lives. His voice rose, filling the cemetery with righteous anger. She is also the wife, the widow, of General Thomas Jefferson Reynolds, the man we are here to honor today. They were married for 25 years. She was holding his hand when he died 4 days ago. She should have been escorted through these gates with a full honor guard. She should have been treated with the dignity and respect that her service and her sacrifice deserve. Washington's eyes burned into Thornton, Morrison, Sterling, and Blackwood. Instead, she was assaulted, brutalized, and humiliated at the worst moment of her life because you looked at her skin color, her simple dress, and decided she couldn't possibly belong here. You didn't check your lists thoroughly. You didn't verify her identity. You didn't make a single phone call. You saw a black woman and assumed she was a threat, a liar, a criminal trying to crash a funeral, and you treated her accordingly. The silence that followed was deafening. If this moment of justice and accountability speaks to you, subscribe and like this video right now. Amara's journey is just beginning, and you need to see how this ends. Sir, we were just following protocol, Blackwood tried weakly. Protocol? Washington roared. Your protocol was to brutalize a grieving widow? Your protocol was to ignore her identification, her documents, her desperate pleas? Your protocol was to physically assault a disabled combat veteran? He pulled out his phone, fingers moving with angry precision. I'm calling Judge Advocate General Hayes right now. I'm filing formal charges against all four of you for assault, dereliction of duty, and conduct unbecoming. You will face court-martial, and I will personally ensure that every single second of video that these people captured, he gestured to the crowd of mourners, most still recording, is submitted as evidence. General Washington, please, Sterling begged, tears running down her face. We made a mistake. We didn't know. We thought, you thought? Washington cut her off savagely. You didn't think. That's the problem. You assumed. You judged. You brutalized. And you did it on sacred ground, at a funeral, to a woman who has given more to this country than you ever will. He turned back to Amara, his voice softening. Colonel Reynolds, if you're able, if you can bear it, your husband is waiting. I will personally escort you to your place of honor at the front. And these four, he glanced back at them with utter contempt, will be removed from this cemetery immediately and held pending court-martial proceedings. Amara nodded, unable to speak, her body shaking with grief and trauma and the shock of validation after such brutal dismissal. Washington offered his arm, and she took it, allowing him to guide her toward the gate that had been barred to her moments before. As they passed through, every single person in that line of mourners, generals, senators, admirals, decorated veterans, stood at attention and saluted. Not for Washington's rank, but for hers, for her service, for her sacrifice, for the injustice she'd endured and the dignity with which she'd borne it. Behind them, military police were already moving in to apprehend Thornton, Morrison, Sterling, and Blackwood. The perfect military funeral had become a crime scene. Amara's story didn't begin at that gate, and the cruelty she faced that day wasn't born in a vacuum. To understand how this moment of injustice could occur on such sacred ground, you had to understand who Amara Thompson truly was. Amara's mother, Diane Thompson, had cleaned houses for wealthy white families in Lake Forest for 30 years, taking the train 3 hours each day so her daughter could attend decent schools in their South Side Chicago neighborhood. Diane would leave at 4 in the morning and return at 8 at night, her hands raw from industrial cleaning chemicals, her knees aching from scrubbing floors, her back bent from years of lifting and carrying. She never complained. She had a mission. Her daughter would not clean houses. Her daughter would fly. When Amara was 12 years old, her mother saved for 2 years to take her to the Air and Water Show in Chicago. They stood on the beach at North Avenue, surrounded by thousands of people, and watched the Blue Angels tear across the sky in perfect formation. The sound was deafening. The precision was breathtaking. And when those FA-18s went vertical, climbing straight up into the clouds with a roar that shook your chest cavity, little Amara looked up at her mother and said, I want to do that. Diane Thompson, who'd never finished high school, who'd spent her entire life making other people's homes beautiful while living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment, looked down at her daughter and said, Then you'll do it. 15 years later, Second Lieutenant Amara Thompson stood in front of an F-16 Fighting Falcon at Nellis Air Force Base, her hands trembling as she completed her pre-flight check on the aircraft she'd be flying solo for the first time. She thought about her mother, who'd died of cancer 3 months earlier, her hands still rough from chemicals, her dream realized in her daughter's wings. It was at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, during a joint training exercise in 2000, that she first met then Colonel Thomas Reynolds. He was evaluating pilot performance, and she'd just completed a training mission that had left her instructor speechless, threading her F-16 through a simulated surface-to-air missile defense system with such precision and creativity that the scenario designers had to revise their parameters. "Where'd you learn to fly like that?" Reynolds asked her after the debrief. "South side of Chicago," Amara replied. "Dodging trouble teaches you to be creative with your flight paths." He laughed. They talked for 3 hours about tactics, strategy, and the future of air combat. 6 months later, they were engaged. A year after that, married. The accusations started immediately. Gold digger, career climber, affirmative action hire who'd trapped a rising star. The whispers followed them through every posting, every promotion, every base. When Reynolds made general, the whispers became open speculation. Had she slept her way to her own rank? Was she really qualified, or just a diversity checkbox? Amara's response was to become the best combat pilot the Air Force had. In 2003, during Operation Iraqi Freedom, her flight was supporting ground troops under heavy fire near Fallujah. Surface-to-air missiles lit up the sky. One of her wingmen was hit and ejected. Another turned back with engine damage. Amara stayed, making pass after pass to suppress enemy positions, her aircraft taking shrapnel that shredded her left aileron and damaged her hydraulics. She completed her mission, saved 17 American lives on the ground, and then flew her crippled F-16 140 miles back to base on backup systems, landing with no flaps and minimal control. They gave her the Distinguished Flying Cross. Some people still said she'd only gotten it because she was black and the military needed good publicity. When Thomas retired with 4 stars in 2020 and Amara retired as a colonel in 2022, her shoulder damage from that Fallujah mission finally forcing her to ground herself, they'd planned to travel, to volunteer, to finally live the life they'd postponed for decades of service. They'd had 15 months. 15 months of morning coffee on the porch, evening walks through Arlington, weekends at the beach. 15 months of finally just being together. The heart attack took him on a Tuesday afternoon while he was gardening. Amara held his hand and called 911 and tried to remember her first aid training through the panic. He died in the ambulance. His last words, "Love you, Colonel." The investigation into what happened at Gate 7 began before the funeral even concluded. General Washington had meant what he said about pressing charges, and video from dozens of cell phones provided incontrovertible evidence of every moment of Amara's humiliation and assault. But the investigation revealed something far worse than 4 individuals making a terrible mistake. It revealed a pattern. Federal investigators discovered that over the previous 18 months, 12 other black family members had been delayed, questioned, or temporarily denied entry to military funerals at Arlington. 6 Hispanic families had experienced similar treatment. Asian American veterans had been asked for additional identification despite having proper credentials. In every case, the security personnel had made judgment calls based on whether individuals looked like they belonged at military functions. The media explosion was immediate and brutal. Every major network led with the story. Decorated combat pilot assaulted at husband's funeral. The videos went viral within hours. By evening, Amara's face, tear-streaked, bruised, desperate, was everywhere. Social media erupted with rage. Veterans groups issued statements. Civil rights organizations demanded action. Within 48 hours, the Department of Defense announced a comprehensive review of security protocols at all military installations and ceremonies. The Secretary of Defense himself called Amara to apologize. Congress scheduled hearings. The 4 individuals responsible were suspended pending court-martial. But Amara barely noticed any of it. She was still trying to process the fact that she'd buried her husband, and that the last memories she had of his funeral were of being brutalized by the very institution they'd both served for decades. 3 weeks later, the court-martial proceedings began at Joint Base Meyer-Henderson Hall just across from Arlington Cemetery. The military courtroom was packed with media, veterans, and observers from civil rights organizations. Judge Advocate General Rebecca Hayes prosecuted the case personally, unprecedented for what would normally be handled by junior prosecutors. The evidence was overwhelming. The videos showed everything. Morrison's brutal grip on Amara's arm, the bruises forming in real time, Thornton's dismissive refusal to check identification, Sterling's sneering commentary about Amara's dress, Blackwood's condescending lecture about protocol. Audio captured every word, every insult, every assumption, but the most damning evidence came from the security logs themselves. Amara's name had been on the family list the entire time. Amara Thompson Reynolds, spouse of deceased, Colonel U.S. Air Force, retired. It was right there, in the system they claimed to have checked. They simply hadn't looked because they'd decided, based on her appearance, that she couldn't possibly be who she claimed to be. Hayes stood before the military tribunal, her voice cold with controlled fury. The defendants claim they were following protocol. Let me be absolutely clear, there is no protocol in the United States military that authorizes security personnel to physically assault a grieving widow based on the color of her skin. There is no protocol that permits ignoring valid identification. There is no protocol that allows assumptions about who belongs at a military ceremony based on how someone is dressed or what they look like. She pulled up a video on the courtroom screens, Morrison kicking aside Amara's spilled photos, treating memories of a 25-year marriage like garbage. This is not protocol. This is racism. This is brutality. This is a disgrace to every value the United States military claims to represent. Thornton's defense attorney argued that his client had been overwhelmed by the security requirements of a high-profile funeral, that he'd made an honest mistake under pressure, that there had been no racial animus in his actions. Hayes destroyed that argument with a single question during cross-examination. Sergeant Major Thornton, in your 30 years of military service, how many white women have you physically restrained and removed from military ceremonies for not looking like they belonged? The silence that followed was answer enough. Morrison's attorney tried to claim his client had used reasonable force to remove a disruptive individual. Hayes countered by calling Dr. Sarah Chen, an emergency room physician who testified that the bruises on Amara's arm were consistent with excessive force that could have caused permanent nerve damage to someone with Amara's existing shoulder injury. Sterling attempted to defend her comments about Amara's dress by saying she was simply maintaining standards for a formal military event. Hayes presented photos from the same funeral showing white family members in casual clothing who'd been waved through without question. Blackwood's defense was that he'd arrived after the situation had already escalated and was simply trying to maintain order. Hayes played audio of him lecturing Amara about chain of command and suggesting she couldn't actually be a colonel because of how she looked and acted in a moment of extreme emotional distress. The tribunal deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Sergeant Major Richard Thornton, guilty of assault, dereliction of duty, and conduct unbecoming. Sentenced to 2 years in military prison, reduction in rank to private, dishonorable discharge, and forfeiture of all retirement benefits. Corporal Bradley Morrison, guilty of assault with aggravating circumstances, excessive force against a disabled veteran. Sentenced to 3 years in military prison, dishonorable discharge. Lieutenant Patricia Sterling, guilty of dereliction of duty and conduct unbecoming. Sentenced to 1 year in military prison, dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of retirement benefits. Colonel Dennis Blackwood, guilty of dereliction of duty and failure to intervene. Sentenced to 18 months in military prison, reduction in rank to lieutenant, dishonorable discharge, loss of retirement benefits. Additionally, all four were ordered to pay restitution to Amara for emotional distress and medical expenses related to her injuries. As the sentences were read, Morrison's face crumbled. Sterling sobbed openly. Blackwood stared straight ahead, his military career of 32 years ending in absolute disgrace. Thornton remained expressionless, but his hands trembled as military police moved forward to take them into custody. Justice was served. Richard Thornton would spend 2 years behind bars, his entire military legacy destroyed by his racism and brutality. If this moment of accountability moved you, subscribe, like, and comment. Would you have shown them mercy? But the consequences extended far beyond the 4 individuals in that courtroom. The investigation had uncovered systemic issues in how Arlington National Cemetery handled security, particularly for families of color. 18 security personnel were disciplined or terminated. The entire vetting process was overhauled. New training was mandated for all personnel on implicit bias and proper verification procedures. The Department of Defense implemented new policies requiring multiple verification steps before any family member could be denied entry to a military ceremony. Video recording became mandatory at all security checkpoints. A dedicated ombudsman was appointed to handle complaints about discriminatory treatment at military facilities. Congress passed legislation, informally known as the Colonel Reynolds Act, that provided federal civil rights protections for military families and established penalties for discrimination at military ceremonies and installations. But for Amara, sitting in the courtroom as the sentences were handed down, none of it could undo what had happened. None of it could give her back those moments at her husband's funeral. None of it could erase the memory of being brutalized while trying to say goodbye to the man she'd loved for 25 years. When reporters surrounded her outside the courthouse, asking how she felt about the verdict, Amara's response was simple and devastating. "I don't feel vindicated. I feel tired. I served this country for 23 years. My husband served for 40. And when I needed that service honored, when I needed to be treated with basic human dignity at the worst moment of my life, the system failed me spectacularly. These 4 people going to prison doesn't change that. It doesn't heal that wound. It just acknowledges it." She paused, her eyes distant. But maybe acknowledgement is where change begins. 6 months after the court-martial, Amara stood in front of 300 Air Force cadets at the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. She'd been invited to speak as part of a new diversity and leadership training program, one of dozens of reforms implemented in the wake of what the media had dubbed the Arlington Incident. She wore her dress blues for the first time since Thomas's funeral, her chest decorated with ribbons that told the story of her service. 2 distinguished flying crosses, the Bronze Star with Valor, the Purple Heart, the Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters. The cadets sat in absolute silence as she took the podium. "My name is Colonel Amara Thompson Reynolds," she began, her voice steady. "And I'm going to tell you about the day I was assaulted at my husband's funeral because security personnel looked at my skin color and decided I didn't belong there." For 40 minutes, she spoke with brutal honesty about her experience. The physical pain of Morrison's grip, the emotional devastation of being treated like a criminal while trying to mourn, the systemic racism that had allowed it to happen. She didn't soften any details. She didn't make it easier for them to hear. "Some of you in this room will become officers," she said, her eyes scanning the young faces before her. "Some of you will make decisions about who gets respect and who gets suspicion. Some of you will have the power to destroy someone's dignity with a single assumption. And I'm here to tell you, that assumption might be about someone like me, someone who's served, someone who's sacrificed, someone who's earned every right to be treated with honor." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "The 4 people who assaulted me that day thought they were doing their jobs. They thought they were following protocol. They thought their judgment was sound. They were wrong on every count. And now they're in prison, their careers destroyed, their legacies ruined, all because they couldn't see past their own biases long enough to check a list. A cadet raised her hand, a young black woman in the third row. "Ma'am, how do we make sure we don't become them?" Amara smiled sadly. "You question every assumption you make about people. You verify instead of presume. You remember that dignity costs you nothing but means everything to the person receiving it. And you understand that the uniform doesn't make you immune to prejudice. It makes you more accountable for it." The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. Afterward, dozens of cadets lined up to thank her, to share their own stories of discrimination, to promise they'd be better. Amara listened to each one, recognizing in their young faces the same determination she'd had at their age, the belief that they could change a broken system from within. It was exhausting work, this constant education, this perpetual explaining of basic human dignity. But it was also necessary. Because the investigation that followed her assault had revealed something terrifying. Her experience wasn't unique. It was just the one that got filmed. General Isaiah Washington had become Amara's most vocal advocate. He'd used his position and influence to push for comprehensive reforms across all military branches. He'd testified before Congress. He'd written op-eds for major newspapers. He'd made it his mission to ensure that what happened to Amara would never happen to another military family. 2 years after the Arlington incident, Washington called Amara with news. "The Secretary of Defense wants to create a new position," he told her. "Special Advisor for Military Family Dignity and Civil Rights." It would be a civilian position, reporting directly to the Secretary. Full authority to investigate complaints, recommend policy changes, and oversee implementation of anti-discrimination measures across all military installations worldwide. "Okay," Amara said slowly. "That sounds important." "It is, and he wants you for the job." Amara sat in silence, processing this. The position would mean returning to the world that had brutalized her. It would mean reliving her trauma every time she investigated a new complaint. It would mean facing resistance from people who thought she was overreacting, who believed discrimination wasn't really a problem, who resented her presence as a reminder of the military's failures. "I'll do it," she said. Washington laughed with relief. "I told him you would. You're going to make a lot of people uncomfortable, Amara." "Good," she replied. "Comfort is what allows injustice to persist." In her new role, Amara traveled to military bases across the United States and overseas. She listened to countless stories from service members and military families who'd experienced discrimination. Racial profiling at base gates, discriminatory housing assignments, biased performance evaluations, unequal application of military justice. Each story added to the mountain of evidence that the problem was systemic, not isolated. She implemented new training programs that didn't just lecture about bias, but created actual accountability measures. She established anonymous reporting systems that protected complainants from retaliation. She worked with the Judge Advocate General's office to ensure discriminatory conduct had real consequences. And slowly, painfully, change began to happen. 3 years into her tenure, Amara received a letter from Sergeant Major Richard Thornton. He was 18 months into his 2-year sentence at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth. "Colonel Reynolds, I don't expect you to read this. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve either. But I'm writing anyway because my therapist says I need to take accountability, and more importantly, because you deserve to hear this directly from me. What I did to you that day was unforgivable. I assaulted you. I brutalized you. I treated you like a criminal when you were a grieving widow and a decorated veteran. I did this because I looked at your skin color and made assumptions that had no basis in reality or protocol. I've had 2 years to think about that day. 2 years to sit with the shame of what I did. 2 years to understand that my actions weren't just a mistake. They were the culmination of a lifetime of unconscious and conscious biases that I never examined or challenged. I destroyed your husband's funeral. I destroyed my own career. I destroyed my family's financial security. But most importantly, I destroyed any right I had to call myself a soldier. Because soldiers are supposed to protect people like you, not assault them. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I did. I understand the harm, and I understand that I can never undo it. If my punishment and my public disgrace can prevent even one other person from making the same choices I made, then maybe some microscopic good can come from the terrible wrong I committed against you. With profound remorse and shame, Richard Thornton Amara read the letter 3 times. She felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory, just exhaustion. She filed it away with the hundreds of other documents related to her case and continued her work. 5 years after Arlington, Amara stood once again in that cemetery, but this time by choice, not compulsion. She'd been invited to speak at the dedication of a new memorial, the Military Family Dignity Monument, erected near the tomb of the unknown soldier. The monument featured a bronze statue of a woman in a simple dress standing at a gate, her head held high despite the figures blocking her path. At the base, an inscription read, "In memory of all military families who have faced discrimination, prejudice, and injustice while honoring their loved ones. May their dignity never again be questioned. May their service never again be dismissed. May their grief never again be compounded by cruelty." Below that, a second inscription. "Dedicated in honor of Colonel Amara Thompson Reynolds, USAF, retired, whose courage in the face of injustice sparked reforms that protect military families across all branches of service." Amara hadn't known about the second inscription until the monument was unveiled. She stood before it, tears streaming down her face, as military families from across the nation gathered to honor not just her, but every person who'd ever been treated as less than they deserved. General Washington spoke first, his voice carrying across the crowd of thousands. 5 years ago, on this sacred ground, we failed Colonel Reynolds in the most fundamental way possible. We failed to see her humanity. We failed to honor her service. We failed to protect her dignity when she needed it most. That failure exposed systemic problems that had persisted for decades, hurting countless families whose stories were never filmed, never investigated, never addressed. He turned to look directly at Amara. But Colonel Reynolds didn't let that failure define her. She transformed her pain into purpose. She turned her trauma into systematic change. She ensured that her experience, as horrific as it was, would be the last of its kind. Because of her work, military families across the world are safer, more respected, more protected. Because of her courage, we are a better military and a better nation. When it was Amara's turn to speak, she stood at the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. Military personnel of every rank and branch, families of every race and background, civil rights leaders, politicians, and everyday citizens who'd followed her story. "I didn't want to be here 5 years ago," she said simply. "I wanted to be at my husband's funeral, mourning privately, honoring quietly. Instead, I became a symbol of everything wrong with how we treat people who don't fit our unconscious expectations of what belongs." She gestured to the monument behind her. "This statue isn't really about me. It's about every person who's ever been stopped at a gate they had every right to pass through. Every person who's been questioned when they should have been welcomed. Every person who's had to prove their worth, their identity, their humanity to someone who should have simply shown them respect." Her voice grew stronger. "My husband, General Thomas Reynolds, spent 40 years serving this country, and on the day we buried him, I was assaulted on ground he'd fought to protect. That irony is not lost on me. But neither is this. His death, and the injustice that followed, sparked changes that will protect thousands of families he never met. That's the only comfort I can take from what happened, that Thomas's legacy now includes not just his military service, but the reforms that came from my fight for dignity at his funeral." She paused, her eyes finding the faces of young service members in the crowd. "To every person wearing a uniform, you have immense power, power to protect or harm, power to honor or humiliate, power to see humanity or reinforce prejudice. Use that power wisely. Question your assumptions. Verify before you judge. And remember that the person you're about to dismiss, remove, or restrain might be someone who's given everything for the same flag you serve. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Amara barely heard it. She was looking at the bronze statue, her statue, and thinking about all the people it represented. The ones whose stories were never told, the ones who suffered in silence, the ones who didn't have video evidence or a four-star general to intervene. She was speaking for all of them now. And she would continue speaking until the system changed completely, until dignity became automatic instead of something you had to fight for, until no one else had to endure what she'd endured. That evening, as the sun set over Arlington Cemetery, Amara walked alone to Thomas's grave. She'd brought flowers, simple white roses, his favorite. She sat on the grass beside the white marble headstone and talked to him the way she did every week. "I think you'd be proud," she said softly. "Not of what happened, but of what came after. We changed something, Thomas. We actually changed something." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of earth and memory. In the distance, she could hear taps being played for another funeral, a reminder that this sacred ground continued its solemn duty, honoring those who served. But now, because of her fight, it honored all of them with equal dignity. Black, white, brown, officer and enlisted, male and female. Everyone who'd earned the right to rest here could be certain their families would be treated with the respect they deserved. It wasn't enough. It would never undo what happened. But it was something. Amara stood, touched Thomas's headstone one last time, and walked back toward the gate, the same gate where she'd been stopped 5 years ago. This time, the guards snapped to attention and saluted as she approached. "Good evening, Colonel Reynolds," one of them said respectfully. "Good evening," Amara replied, returning the salute. As she walked through, she remembered the terror and humiliation of being dragged away from this place. But she also remembered the strength she'd found in that moment, the refusal to accept injustice even when overwhelming force tried to silence her. That strength had changed a system. That strength had protected thousands of families. That strength had transformed trauma into legacy, and that strength would never let her forget. Dignity is not a privilege granted by those in power. It's a right that belongs to every human being, and it's worth fighting for, no matter the cost. If Amara's journey from victim to advocate, from tragedy to transformation, has inspired you to stand up against injustice in your own life, then subscribe, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what this story meant to you. Share it with someone who needs to hear that dignity is worth fighting for. Because stories like Amara's don't just inform us, they empower us to demand better, to be better, and to ensure that no one else has to fight alone for the basic respect they deserve. Her fight didn't end at that gate. It began there, and now it continues with each of us.